stands for like,
Oh, ushers? Okay.
Good evening, everyone. I know there's a light here somewhere, but I don't know where it is. Hey, Bruce, where's the light? Oh, well, I think, oh, there it is. Okay, so, hi. Thanks for being here tonight. It is always a pleasure to welcome audiences for our annual Lambert Lecture series. And I can hardly believe, Bill and Sheila, who are here with us tonight, that it has been 10 years since we inaugurated this. Indeed. It's also really hard for me to believe that it's been a decade since I made my way to the Upper East Side of New York, very intrepidly knocking on their, Upper West Side, sorry. Oh, could I do that? Whoa, bad. Okay, well, now I'm even kind of more intrepid, but in any event. This was after a few phone conversations with someone who at that point was a complete stranger to me, but whom we had learned was an alum of Ohio State. And let's just say that our initial telephone conversations were kind of gruff and terse and not terribly encouraging, but nonetheless, I did make the trek to the Upper West Side, only to find two of the most remarkable people on the planet who have become absolute paragons of patronage for the Wexner Center, as well as for many institutions in the country. So Bill and Sheila, we always love having you here. Thank you. And of course, tonight's Lambert Lecture is occasioned by the 25th anniversary exhibition that we currently have on view in our galleries, Transfigurations, Modern Masters from the Wexner Family Collection. Hope by now that you've all had a chance to wander through, maybe not once, but twice, and that maybe you'll wander through again 2 or 3 more times between now and when the exhibition closes. It's practically halfway done already, and that in and of itself is kind of a scary thought. But for those of you who have followed the exhibition thus far, you know that we had the great fortune to engage none other than curator and art historian and critic extraordinaire Robert Storr as our guest curator for the exhibition. And it has been a great personal and professional pleasure to work closely with Rob as we kind of fashioned the installation and, of course, the catalog, which he has contributed a few essays to, as has Ohio State's own Lisa Florman, who I believe is here this evening. I am not one who ever pushes books on our audiences. I don't believe in necessarily priming the revenue pump from the podium. But I will tell you, if you are even remotely interested in something more than just a cursory investigation of these artists, I can't highly enough recommend this publication to you. Rob, among other things, is an astute, original, and completely fascinating writer, and it just flows. It's really brilliant, and I have to say I've learned a lot from reading it all. In connection with Rob's visit, we thought, because it's been so important to us to somehow bring this more historic material into a kind of dialogue with the more rigorously contemporary program that we do here at the Wexner Center most of the time. We wanted to bring some contemporary voices into the mix, hence the video that is partway up the ramp in what we call our reading room, which brings together 10 different artists or architects to talk about what they find to be the ongoing legacy and influence of Picasso, Giacometti, and Dubuffet on their own practice or on the art of the moment. And among the artists that we invited to be one of the spokespeople in that video is Carroll Dunham, known as Tip Dunham. And as we saw the footage from those conversations, we thought this would be the perfect interlocutor for our conversation tonight with Rob. But recognizing that some of you may not be as familiar with Tip's work as you might be, although we did have a wonderful painting here just last spring as part of our Comic Future show, I thought I would just provide you with a few snippets from some reviews from, gosh, the past 25 years. So it's a kind of this is your life Tip Dunham moment. So first off, from Holland Cotter, New York Times, 1993. The painter's touch is light and clean, an unusual blend of well-schooled painterly finesse and graffiti art slickness. Most of all, they refer back to Philip Guston's monumental, thickly painted heads from the 70s. In fact, the qualities that define Guston's work, an appetite for the grotesque blended with a keen sensitivity to the processes of painting, also apply to Mr. Dunham's new painting. He couldn't have picked a better model, and he's doing it proud. There are numerous other accolades that seem to compound with the years. Michael Kimmelman in 2002 on Dunham's retrospective at the New Museum, calling it a raucous pleasure marking the artist's steady evolution from abstraction toward a figuration of escalated nuttiness and technical panache. And he goes on to place Dunham squarely in the company of such predecessors as Dali, Larry Poons, John Wesley, Peter Saul, Robert Crumb, a real rogues gallery, and such compatriots as Elizabeth Murray and Mike Kelly. Ken Johnson on Tip's show at Gladstone Gallery in 2009, this joyous show of sweet, goofy, raunchy paintings might be the best of Carroll Dunham's nearly 30-year career. And he goes on to say, the images are turbulent art, exuberantly so. They find Mr. Dunham on the threshold of a new Eden. But my favorite quote, and perhaps most relevant to this evening, is from 2012, when it was pronounced that Dunham's paintings, which call to mind Henri Rousseau, Picasso, and R. Crumb, look as if they were made in the fevers of inspiration, as if the artist was possessed by the spirit of his own inner wild woman. Now, what better artists could we bring to talk about Picasso, Giacometti, and Dubuffet? So with that, with thanks to my colleagues here, Amanda Potter and Kelly Morgan in particular for orchestrating tonight's event, please join me in welcoming Rob Storr and Tip Dunham.
Okie doke, I think we're mic'd. Are you mic'd?
I think so.
Okay, well, Sherry stole some of my lines, several of them, but that's because we work kind of symbiotically or synchronically, or I'm not exactly sure what, so our minds move in the same patterns. But I would just simply say that this is, I think, the second Lambert lecture I've done or something like that, but mercifully this is a conversation, so there should be a series of Lambert conversations as well as Lambert lectures, and this will be a back and forth between the two of us and will be as near as possible, I guess, a kind of painter talk situation, painter talk about painters, about other painters. I'll just add one other thing. I first saw Tip's work in a different context. He and I both, once upon a time, were studio assistants for Dorothy Rockburn. And I remember seeing in Dorothy's incredibly well-appointed, incredibly immaculate, incredibly minimalist loft, a very funky drawing in gray, blushing with pink, with sort of polyps of some kind. And it was an early Dunham before any of the artists that are now associated with him came on the scene. It was sort of pure incubus Dunham. And I thought, this is really interesting. So I've watched that creature, looks a little bit like a ginger root. I've watched that creature grow for a long time, and it keeps growing. So I just would like to say that this is a major, major artist, and with many surprises past and many surprises future. So the conversation will be a painter about another artist or several other artists who did the same thing. Maybe where we could start a little bit is with the last room, where it isn't just one artist, it's two artists. It's Giacometti in two modes, a painting and a large group of sculptures, and then Susan Rothenberg, who's a contemporary of yours. And I wonder if you could talk about the dynamic between artists of your generation and younger generations with somebody like Giacometti, who is a canonical figure, and for whom there's an academy of Giacometti, a sort of school of erasure that exists in the world. But it's another thing to really see Giacometti in a different light, as Susan, I think, did. And I wonder how you see Giacometti.
Giacometti was the first, important modern artist that I knew, because when I was about, I must have been 10 or something, my parents took me on a Sunday to the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut, near where I grew up, and there was either there was Giacometti in the collection or there was an exhibition, I don't really know, but I remember seeing these little figures and being really taken with them. It's a memory that's always stayed with me. And I don't know, I think for a while Giacometti was hard to look at for people of our generation. It seemed almost too familiar, like it not quite to the point of seeming trite, but it was hard to kind of know what to do with it. And now it looks so great again. And I think that happens with artists, where enough time passes and you kind of go through what you thought you knew. I would say that's happened to me with all three of the artists, with Picasso, Dubuffet, and Giacometti, that you think you know, you're sort of taught to think a certain thing, and you think it for a while, and then you might get sick of thinking that and lose interest, and then you can come back fresh for your own reasons. So seeing this room you created, which is completely unlike anything I've seen. I mean, the Rothenberg horse paintings and Giacometti together is a very surprising thing, and it really works. And I don't entirely know why it looks so good. But
the ingredients are great.
Well, no, they are, but I mean that could also be sort of dissonant, but it isn't. And I wouldn't have any way of knowing what Susan's thoughts on Giacometti are, but there's something about the focus of those paintings, the repetitiveness and the depth of the exploration of this one thing that seems to go really well with the insistency that Giacometti had in his work.
I mean, one of the things that I was just looking at this evening, again, the more you look at somebody, the more you see things that you wouldn't have occurred to you before. But Giacometti is on one level all about the immediacy of the touch, of making that twist to the form or putting that mark down and so on. On the other hand, the result looks archaic. It's weirdly time bound in the other direction, and that tension. And in some ways, Susan's paintings look like red clay wall paintings or something.
Absolutely, like they looked that way when I remember when I first saw them. They jarred me, and I didn't really know what to do with them because they did have that feeling of a kind of archaeological thing. I don't know. I think the palette and also the subject. Lascaux cave paintings weren't a huge influence on contemporary art at that point, so it was quite original, really.
Yeah. It's also, though, that you can find yourself on a trajectory that crosses somebody else's without ever being aware that one, that it will, two, that when it does, those associations will begin to change the way things are interpreted. I mean, do you feel in your work, when people begin to make specific comparisons to Guston or whoever it might be, do you feel that's a welcome situation, or do you feel that becomes weight on...
It got a little over-determined, I have to say. I mean, it's not that it's unwelcome, because, I mean, Guston as an example of someone whose work I, at a certain point, found a use for it. I found a kind of resonant wavelength to interact with it on, and for a while I really thought a lot about it, but I think one kind of moves past those things. And other art of earlier art of dead people, is part of the one's diet going forward. I mean, it's kind of a source of nutrition for me. So at different times, you find a use for different things, and it isn't always what other people see. It's very personal, very inward. But I don't know, if you're the type of artist as I am that's looked at a lot of other art and likes to think about what one is doing as embedded in some sort of continuum of artists working as a kind of conversation over long periods of time, then you can call it influence, you can call it affinity, you can call it lots of different things, but those relationships are very important.
Or you can call it sympathetic vibrations, because I think in Susan's case, she didn't think a lot about Giacometti. She was aware of him, but she wasn't. There was, again, this school of Giacometti in the 50s and 60s where everybody tried to be existential and anguished, and she's certainly not there.
No.
So I think she kind of found herself in the same place without expecting to.
Well, that's why Giacometti became so uninteresting for a while, I think, is because that whole, the kind of mid-century European bummer sensibility, which he doesn't really bear the responsibility for, but he certainly was an influence on a lot of that work. There was particularly, given the way art was being thought about in the States, particularly in New York, I moved to New York in the early 70s, and I would imagine Susan was there already, or we probably moved there about the same time. But those concerns were just not on the table. That's what I mean when I say, like, over time, maybe you can come back to things fresh if enough time passes. And I'm very struck when I see the Giacomettis about that archaic quality you're talking about. But I think that's something that happened in modernism that we forgot for a while, that this notion of archetypes, which was a big part of psychological thinking, and it was a key thought in 20th century intellectual life, is present in modernist art. It's very important. And it moves through into aspects of New York school painting.
I mean, the history of reception of art is a history related to, but quite different from the history of the making of it and the things that engendered it. And I think people tend to forget that fact. And it's very interesting to look at reception, but you have to look at it as something apart from rather than the essential truth of the work you're talking about. And one of the interesting things about reception of Giacometti, it relates also to the reception of Dubuffet, because both of them became well-known in the after-war era. Actually, Giacometti had a head start on Dubuffet, but not by much. And they both chose as their primary venue, actually, a New York gallery, Pierre Matisse. And so they were the young kids up against the old school of Paris, and they made their moves in New York before they really fully consolidated their positions in France. And I'm interested that Giacometti and Dubuffet should have been shown together quite often, represented by the same dealer. As I look at their work, they couldn't be more different. I wonder how that strikes you.
When you say, I'm curious. I mean, they are very different, but then I could imagine, like, with enough historical distance, they might not seem so different again. Like there is an archaic, I guess that's the right word, a kind of archaic quality in Dubuffet as well. The way the figures are so schematized and scratched into a surface, it feels very urgent and almost like more to do with magic than with the tradition of representational drawing that led to modernism. And there's also something so material about the paintings. I mean, I think when I was a young artist, there was no space in the story anyone was telling me to really fit Dubuffet in. And I didn't think much about Dubuffet at all until I had my own reasons to, which had to do with the idea that something could be that crude and direct and have a kind of depth to it, which was a thought that hadn't really occurred to me. So I actually am fairly comfortable thinking about the two of them. They seem to exist fairly comfortably together for me when I think about it.
I see Dubuffet as actually often laugh out loud funny, and funny materially as
Yeah,
well
that's very different.
funny materially and funnily in terms of the drawing. I mean, like, all of that, what you call hutbat, which means, deep pace, high pace, is a kind of deliberate travesty of good painterly technique, French style.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's absolutely true, and that's kind of the other way to look at it. And I guess it'd be hard to find anything that funny about Giacometti's work.
He wasn't a funny guy.
So I hear. No, that is very different, and in that sense, I see what you mean. But you know what I mean? Like, from another point of view, there's a sort of, I mean, they deal with the human figure. That's the main structure of what they were doing, or kind of the vehicle for it. And it's done in a very, I mean, it's approached quite differently, but arrives at a kind of schematization, which seems to involve some notion, of archetypes and of a sort of deep time human set of concerns. But there is also Dubuffet is quite different because of his relationship to what we now call outsider art, art brut, art of the insane. That taking that whole precinct of art as a source of inspiration was quite an original thing and quite different from anyone else, I think.
Have you ever seen any of his earlier work?
No, I've been to the Art Brut Museum in Switzerland, but I don't think I've ever seen what he did before.
Because he was a wine merchant or
Yeah,
a family
that
wine,
I knew.
and he had quite a decent career going before the war hit, and the work he made is exactly in the style of Picasso's neoclassical drawings, and he had an incredibly fine hand.
I didn't know that.
And actually, the Modern owns one of his mother, so the Dubuffet should have a mother, that he should draw her reverentially in a French 17th century armchair, and that it should be as beautifully kind of patiently and elegant.
And so his work was kind of seen and known?
He was starting out. He was a.
See, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So his bad boy behavior was a very deliberate, strategic move away from where he had actually been. So, which is again to kind of push off from Picasso. I mean, what's downstairs in Picasso is one artist being multiple things in sequence and sometimes simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
How does the Picasso dynamic read to you nowadays?
I think about Picasso all the time. I was taught to think and did think that his early work was very important when I was first learning about 20th century art history, and I remember when the Museum of Modern Art did that big Picasso show in the 80s, kind of coming away thinking, well, really after Cubism, there's just not that much to think about. Of course, they pretty much kept away the sort of late burst of what he did at the end, and then at some point down the road, because of my own needs, things I was trying to figure out in my work, I, like many other people, started to kind of realize that the things he did towards the end of his life were just amazing. And that got me retroactively going back through and thinking about all of it. So now I pretty much, obviously one has one's favorite things, and I'm not as interested in the blue period as I am what he did in whenever, but the basic thing is that Picasso is this kind of huge octopus of an artist that, I mean, to me he's like, I don't know, like Kant or, that level of thinker, like in painting. I don't think there have been very many people with that profound a level of like taking apart what it is to be an artist and really approaching it from all those different angles. It's an amazing life, and I just think about it all the time.
How do you feel the status of Picasso stands in relation? Okay, many people have said we're pretty much of the same age, when I was sort of in my 30s, well, Picasso was all about, modern art was all about Picasso in the first half, or Picasso and Matisse in the first half, and then the second half, it's all about Duchamp. And for years, we've seen Duchamp-influenced art of many, many varieties. And Duchamp is also a plural artist. But I'm noticing that Picasso is sort of back in conversation, but I wondered if that's a sentiment just for you or whether you see it as a more general phenomenon.
I don't know about it generally. I don't really buy those kinds of diagrams, I think everything is just so much more fluid and complicated than that. It's hard for me to really see too much in the art of younger people that I see. I don't see a huge acknowledgement of the idea about drawing and about distortions of reality that Picasso was interested in. I suppose the multi-stylistic aspect of what he did is a kind of almost like a meta-influence or something, like it opened up in many different ways the idea of what one could think of as having an artistic identity. But I'm also aware at this point, I'm fascinated by Duchamp. It's somebody that I think about a lot, but I don't think my reasons for being interested are the same as the reasons that the claims are made that you just referred to. I mean, I'm interested in that thing in Philadelphia. I've gone to see it a lot of times, and
the Étendard installation.
Yeah, and it's assume you all know, it's the last thing he did, which he worked on for a long time, which is a old wooden door with a couple of peepholes, and you look through and you see this world inside. And I think it's an amazing, amazing thing. I'm not all that interested in Duchamp's alleged influence on conceptual art and on all that whole approach. Just like I know Warhol's a important artist to the point of being probably actually really annoying, but there are things in Warhol I'm interested in, but I'm looking at it as a painter, as someone who likes to make things, so I don't take away from Warhol most of what seems to be being taken away from Warhol. And in Picasso's case, I think it's still maybe not enough time has gone by for it not to seem almost lame to embrace him as an influence. I don't know.
Well, one artist that we were talking about earlier today was who's actually juggled both Picasso and Duchamp is Jasper Johns. Mm-hmm. And he's an interesting character because he was associated with a sort of anti-painting attitude at the beginning of his career, whether or not he felt this at all or
right.
not. And then he became somebody who openly expressed his admiration and involvement with Picasso. And I wonder again, how does somebody like John? He's an older artist, but he's making fresh work. There's a show at the Modern recently. How you see him in relation to this dynamic of old masters and younger old masters and
well, I follow his work very closely, and I really admire it. And I think I'm old enough now to be very interested in what people do when they get old. And Johns is someone who I think is fascinating to me in that way, the way he's kind of followed the inner logic of his work wherever it seemed to take him. And it's almost silly to me when I think back about the kinds of things that were said about his work early on. The idea that that guy was ever in a sort of anti-painting frame of mind seems preposterous now. But, of course, in the context of New York in the late 50s and, people trying to figure out what happened after the high moments of the New York school, you could see how Johns' work would have seemed to undermine all that. But now, in looking back, it seems almost nostalgic compared to a lot of what we see being done. But I have huge admiration for his work, and this is another example of how these things aren't either or. Like his interest in Picasso and his interest in Duchamp have both been subsumed within his interest in making Jasper Johns's. There's no issue of pastiche or even the borrowing is so flat-footed and obvious that you can't think of it as anything other than a kind of endearing acknowledgement of a connection. I didn't used to know what I thought of his use of the Picasso images, but now I'm completely good with it. It just took me a while to see it in the context of how his work was developing.
In terms of, you talked about Picasso, you talked about the Blue Period things being less interesting to you, but there is just an incredible feast of different Picassos in that room. And can you say a little bit about the ones that do engage you directly?
There were three that I was very struck by. I mean, it's all great, but just since you asked. There are a couple of things from his so-called neoclassical phase in the early 20s, one of which is a sort of vaguely Greek-looking woman holding a baby with these chubby hands and chubby fingers and toes. And I love those things. And I think that's the point where he realized that he didn't need to believe the story that he may have been telling himself or that the world was telling him back about what he was supposed to be. The idea that you could come to the point that he did within the Cubist stuff and then turn around and do that is a kind of breathtaking statement about your own freedom. And I have no idea what it would have looked like at the time, because it's easy to see those things as somehow retrograde. But I don't think that's what they are at all. I think they're a kind of radical step into freedom. And then another one is the pink nude on the black chair, which is a really interesting period of his. I mean, it's the only time he really got obsessed with a blonde girlfriend and so there was an entirely different palette that he was working from. And that sort of lavender cloud of flesh and things that you really didn't see earlier or later in his work. And a sort of lack of severity that's really beautiful. Very, to state the obvious, very sexy. And then the other one is the last painting in the room, which you and I were talking about before, which is so the opposite. It's a woman alone. It's a subject he painted over and over and over again, different women, and whenever he had a different person to paint, he seemed to come up with an entirely different way of thinking about painting her. And that one is so, it looks almost like the woman is made of coral or something. Like she's so abrasive and rough and linear and angular. And And then there are these strange details, as we were talking about, like her shoes sitting there, things that are so intimate. And the juxtaposition of this intimate personal space and this kind of like engineering construct called a woman, and the fact that it's painted in such a direct way, it's amazing.
What's interesting, that painting used to belong to Victor and Sally Gans, who also owned a very beautiful war period landscape where there's this great gnarly tree.
Yeah,
And
it reminds me of.
It's like she's actually.
I know exactly
Sculpture.
I know exactly the painting, and she's like that. It's like from the same, evolved in the same environment or something.
Whereas the one in Maria Therese, she's like a flesh whirlpool.
Right.
She'll just draw you in and swallow you up.
Yeah.
Are there favorite paintings of yours in the Dubuffet or favorite objects in the Giacometti section?
Well, I've always really liked Dubuffet's portraits, and so the ones that tend to be most like that. There's one I'd never seen before. Maybe I've seen it in a book, but I don't remember. That's it's someone's name, and then it's subtitled like King of Mexico or something.
Yeah.
And I don't know who that is. Do you know that?
Yeah, he was a French poet, a Surrealist poet.
But it's such an amazingly rich surface. Like it feels like hundreds of colors buried in this sludge that he was just digging out, digging the image out. And it's also, I love the way he drew where it kind of, it's this twisted way of filling up the rectangle of the painting, so the thing kind of goes right out, like his head goes right out to the edge of the top of the painting. And that was a fantastic thing. And also there's a painting in there which surprised me because it's so colorful, the painting of the woman holding her hair with her little fingers. And
She's great.
yeah, and that's such a lyrical feeling thing for him. So I thought that was really great.
Well, I put that painting at that end of the room so it would be directly opposite the de Kooning at the other end,
Yeah,
because they're almost of the same date. They have the same acid green in them. There are a lot of similar qualities, but of course neither man would have been aware of the other at all because it was during the war, basically. But there's, again, the sort of point at which artists of similar intuitions, find each other.
it's amazing that was going on simultaneously.
Yeah.
The Giacomettis, I spent a long time standing next to that big, tall figure of the woman because I for some reason, I feel like most of the Giacomettis I've seen in my recent life have been, he's interesting because he could operate on a continuum from little teeny weeny things to really big things with the same, and it all feels continuous somehow. I mean, if that sculpture of the leg were attached to an entire body, that would be a very large body. And so I was really interested to be around that big, tall one, because it felt different for me. And I have to say, I'm just kind of, I always have loved that dog sculpture. It has so much, it has so much personality. And it's hard to talk about. I don't know, it's kind of cartoonish in a way that I don't think of his work as being. Has a lot of sort of weird body language, the feeling that dog's kind of slinking along. So it's something I don't know, it's just a personal thing, I just really like it.
Me too. In terms of the opportunity to see things like this, even in New York, even at the Modern, even in places which have big collections, you don't often get to see high concentrations of individual artists. You see examples of, sort of canonical
usually
peers.
not.
And I wonder what it's like to be able to just sort of, bathe yourself in a chunk of Giacometti, a chunk of Dubuffet, and a big chunk of Picasso.
Well, it's lovely, and I wish there were more such situations. I mean, it's why a place like, the Menil in Houston is so amazing, when you really see a lot of a person's work brought together. I mean, it's great. It's great to see the story, and that's been the story, and it's been kind of the model of museum. I guess it's been sort of the curatorial model that collections of art have to tell a story, and I think that's great. And I mean, I understand the Museum of Modern Art can't put all the art that it owns of one person up all the time, but I do wish that there were more of that sort of thing, that, because I just don't think there's anything else like seeing a lot of what someone does. And also what's nice about this is that it isn't, we're not being confronted with this sort of retrospective scale of something where you have to spend a huge amount of time trying to figure out where it fits into things historically. And these are kind of distilled experiences through the happenstance or whatever of what the Wexners have collected. But, that kind of filter is really interesting, because that could be for any number of reasons. These happen to be the works that end up in the room. But to be there with them, I mean, particularly, I don't know, it's also really nice to come somewhere and see that. People that live in New York kind of get this idea that all the important stuff is in New York.
It's not.
And it's really great to just walk in and see something of that quality. It's nice. It's different.
And I would just say editorially, when I was at the Modern, I was always bothered by the use of the word story in relation to exhibitions, because, the point of art is not to tell a story about art history. It's not to tell the story of the life of the artist or whatever it is. It's like the art is there because it has things to show you. And if other work by that artist is there, what it has to show you in the aggregate is more about the variety of choices the artist could make. And it's much less important in what sequence that artist made them, or in what narrative of life you might, figure it out. Well, it's just that they're there to be done.
I mean, what was it like for you curating it? It must have been...
It was a gas.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun. And, my sort of favorite experience was with the Giacomettis, just because there were so many of them. And they are all of the same language, basically, but they're actually all very different. And how to get them to sort of talk to each other without seeming to repeat or whatever it is was really interesting. But same thing with the Picasso wall, where you have really, a long wall of essentially neoclassical paintings, and then the Blue Boy and the synthetic cubist paintings at the end, and then you end up with Marie Therese Voltaire, and it's a whole new language. And that's just a wonderful sweep of things to show, so that each shows something about the other as well as about itself.
I was really curious how you thought of putting the Rothenbergs with the Giacomettis. Did a little light bulb just go off in your head?
Something like that, yeah. I mean, I didn't know they had so many to begin with, and I was pretty sure that I wanted to put one or two, but I didn't know they had 5. And so I had written a lot about Susan over the years. I spent a lot of time, like you, looking at Giacometti, and I sort of thought, this is a situation which you can actually make happen. There have always been references back and forth and whatever it is, but we can actually physically do it and see what it looks like, and I can't think of another opportunity. No museum that I know that has that many Rothenbergs.
No, it's pretty unique.
Yeah. By the way, this is parenthetical. I was just at the opening of the Picasso Museum in Paris, which is amazing and is really worth seeing. And one of the things that they have, that he left them, is this marvelous painting from 1914, which is to say, one of the highest years of Cubism, in which for the first time neoclassical figures appear in paintings with abstract elements. And he could speak 2 languages in one painting, not just a sequence of images of different languages. But there was another painting, which I'd never seen before, which was about this big, and it was of a tree. and it looked like he was channeling you.
That's very unlikely.
Well, reincarnation, there are a lot of spiritual...
Time does run in several directions at once, I know.
It does. But it was uncanny, actually. And I was thinking, that somebody's going to come along and see this and say, oh, that's where Carroll Dunham got it. And clearly it's not where you got it. But it's because these things exist
Sadly,
in a way...
no.
It exists as potential. I mean, at least that's the way I read it.
Yeah. I didn't even know there were... there's some really interesting brocks of trees from the sort of transitional, just on the brink of Cubist sort of time. I didn't even know about those paintings until I was already working with that subject.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have it somewhere in my telephone. I'll show it to you. It was really weird. And it also reminded me of the fact that what new art does is to rescue old art that you think you know. I mean, it does things for itself, but it also does things for...
Well, I think a lot of the interests of much younger painters and people in the 80s rescued Picasso. I mean, I think when Picasso was in that show, The New Spirit in Painting, that was a big shift in the way Picasso was being considered. Mm. And I think there are many examples of that, of recent art changing the way earlier things can be understood.
What do you think, is there a center of gravity in contemporary painting? I mean, the field of art in general is way too broad to talk about it. But in terms of painting?
I don't know.
Do you care?
Well, I think I care. I mean, I have to say it's the combination of the way one's life moves, and the fact that the art scene has become so enormous makes me feel much less in touch than I felt when I was younger with what is sort of the work of young artists that are just beginning to exhibit. And I think I tend more and more to wait until I've heard something about something a few times, unless I just happen to stumble across things. But, there certainly are younger artists whose work I'm interested in, but I don't know if I could really isolate a tendency or a set of concerns that characterize them. But I think that the art scene, the art world, whatever we call it, has gotten so much larger and is so clearly not just a New York thing anymore that I wouldn't even presume to kind of map it. And I can't imagine anything more vexing than doing something like which you have done, trying to map it from a curatorial point of view. It's very amorphous to me.
Are there nodes or areas where you see things that give you energy and, or irritation to the point of inspiration?
Well, irritation to the point of inspiration is an interesting way to put something. Like, I do feel there's a sort of, I think I'm really annoyed by the lack of acknowledgement of what I guess we would call the human imagination in a lot of contemporary art. And the idea that there's such an enormous influence of photography and of images captured digitally and sets of references standing in for actual feelings, that I feel that I'm trying to work against those kinds of things. And I'm married to a person who makes photography, so I'm not hostile to photography, but I don't have any interest in it as a a filter through which to think about painting. I'm really interested in painting as a direct, to the extent that it's possible, a sort of unmediated thing. And I find a lot of stuff that I see around just completely wan because I want to see something that's more engaged physically. And I think it's something I adore about all the stuff that's here that seems very different from the way a lot of things feel to me now. But I do think that there are plenty of interesting people working. You know, I'm not into think, you know, like, oh, everything's terrible. But it's not just in art, it's a strange time. We're going through a lot of transitions as a culture.
Do you think about, in Picasso, one of the things about Picasso is he could make an exquisite drawing like the small one that looks like a Steinlein drawing at the beginning of the show, or he could make Guernica. And I can't think of a painter who used the range of scales possible as freely as he did.
Yeah.
And I have a painter friend, Sarah Canwright, who one day got stuck. And she said, well, I don't know what I'm going to do, but the one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a painting the size of Demoiselle d'Avignon. And so she measured it and stretched a canvas and went to work on her Demoiselle d'Avignon, which I think is a wonderful act of sort of mathematical hubris. Or
Yeah.
whatever it is.
How did it all work out?
I don't remember the painting. Probably Sarah doesn't remember it either, but it was an idea that appealed to me. But I wondered, I mean, in terms of your own work, you've made the one, and others too, but the very big painting that the Modern owns. But you've generally stayed within sort of easel painting range.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that for yourself.
Well, it's true. I have. I've only made probably in my whole life 5 paintings which I would consider really large by contemporary standards. I mean, most of my paintings would look quite large in the room of a house, I guess, but I can't, it has something to do with the scale of the marks one makes and the structures one can actually handle with one's body. I don't equate enormous size with importance or ambition. You know, I think that there's a kind of more drilling into quality that I can achieve when I don't feel as though I'm trying to cover too much laterally. And also because my paintings all begin with my drawing on an empty canvas, I like to be able to reach the whole thing. So I think probably if I thought about it, determining factor of the scale of my work has largely been my wingspan. You know, the kind of area that I can actually cover with my own body. But this goes to my previous point that I'm not working with projecting. I need to touch the whole thing and I need to make the whole thing. That's not because I'm, so old school or something. It's all I've been able to figure out that I can do, that feels meaningful to me. So size kind of follows from all that. And
I mean, de Kooning, who's in this show as well, was one of the
he didn't really make very big paintings.
He didn't, no. I think he actually said, I prefer the things that I can reach. And he made Excavation, which is in Chicago. And he made that one very strange kind of stage set painting with Milton Resnick.
Right.
And that's it.
No, I was struck by that when there was the big de Kooning show a while back in New York, that we think of the sort of step into huge scale as being with New York school artists of that generation, and you see it in Pollock and you see it in Newman, and I suppose you see it in Rothko in some way. But de Kooning really held on to a different idea about size and even the things if you see them reproduced that you imagine being very big, they're really not. I mean, his idea of gesture was more kind of in this kind of space. It wasn't this big, like, skywriting kind of idea about it. I like that about his work.
Well, there's something that I saw I did a de Kooning show at the Modern, late de Kooning, and I remember looking at some films, and I'd always seen his sort of whiplash line going through the painting and thought of it in terms of speed.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, he laid those things in so slowly and carefully with a stripper brush, like a bank president's office being painted, And it's just like, but it was so gentle. And the illusion of speed or the illusion of turmoil in a picture, as opposed to how it actually gets made, is very striking. And I think that happens in Picasso. I think it happens in Dubuffet. Dubuffet looks like he's churning, but he's actually very carefully building and constructing an image.
Oh, I think that has to be true. If you just did a painting the way one imagines Dubuffet did paintings, you wouldn't be making interesting things. You'd just be kind of messing around. But you can see it, and so like the two paintings I mentioned when you were asking me about it earlier, those, clearly he had to think through what he was doing with the color in those paintings. They're kind of, it's geological. I mean, it's revealed through the layers in a way that, not that he would have had to pre-visualize it in every detail, but it certainly is a methodical approach. It's not a, kind of thing.
And the littler one that's across the way, it's with a hat and a kind of diabolical smile.
Mm-hmm.
Opposite, not directly opposite, but pretty much opposite the one of the King of Mexico. Both those two paintings have these color effects that look almost like glazing, and may very well be glazing, actually. The glazing was a taboo technique for the most part in modern painting. You were supposed to be direct, alla prima, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And to let color show through color like that was very unusual. In looking at those two paintings, I had a very different idea of what he was about.
Yeah.
And he was much more deliberate and more informed as a technician than I thought he was.
How do you feel about the later stuff, like the red, white, and blue?
The Orlu
things?
paintings?
Yeah.
Some of them are fantastic, and some of them aren't. I love the one of the bus, and it's gritty, dirty, post-war Paris. It's gray. It's all those things.
Yeah.
And yet again, it's not mournful. It's not a tragedy. It's just getting through life, and it's very funny. It's very energized. The tricolor ones, I think, are hit and miss. Some of them. This is a hit, but there are many of them that are not. And it became a kind of fallback language for him, and he didn't really develop it very much in painting, although in sculpture he developed it a lot.
Yeah.
How do you feel?
Similarly, and I always have, there's an enormous Dubuffet sculpture somewhere downtown in New York that's part of that period of his work, and I've always really liked it. It seems like it works really well as a thing in public space. But I have to say I have not yet come, maybe I'll have my moment like I did have with other artists' late work, where I suddenly see it in a different way, and then I can really understand it. But that hasn't happened to me with his late work. It feels kind of chilly to me compared to his, that the gifts or the beautiful things in the earlier work are traded out for something that I don't really understand.
Well, I think he's a prime example of how a really well-made retrospective could make a difference.
Yeah.
Because what curators of retrospectives do is they edit. And they edit in the way that dealers don't want to, and that sometimes artists can't. But if you pare it down and get the really best of the best of the best, I could see him very easily sort of coming back as a force in the world. Because he has this wonderfully sort of discursive hand.
Mm-hmm.
And he sort of knocks it in. Well, to take it to that, I mean, he's a fantastic cartoonist,
Right.
And the status of cartooning in modern art has always been underplayed, or that artists who are good at it use it as a source, but not actually as a way of making art. And this is something that comes back to what you do. I mean, basically, you are a fantastic cartoonist, which is not to say you're less anything else, but I don't know anybody else who can do cartooning as fluently and as inventively as you can. Really.
Who knew? Well, thank you, Rob.
I mean,
no, but I mean, it's...
I'm not one to hand out compliments.
No, that's thank you. It's funny to hear you say it, because it isn't a way I ever thought of what I was doing, you know? In fact, it used to... I'm actually getting really interested in comics now, just like looking at comics, you know, earlier comics.
Yeah.
There's something about what I'm trying to figure out for my own work, like where it wants to go. I'm finding it very rewarding to look at earlier comic art.
And by earlier, you mean what?
I mean, you know, Flash Gordon from the 40s, like, or, you know, Hal Foster, not the art critic, you know, Tarzan and Prince Valiant and stuff like that, like, which is a kind of way of looking at figurative art, but not. But I never, the point, when I started hearing back about my own work, that it showed an influence of cartooning, at first I thought it was kind of interesting because it was so surprising. And I thought, oh yeah, you know, I liked Walt Disney as much as anybody else. But I never saw that as that was never a conscious thing that I was trying to do or to emulate. You know, I kind of backed into it. So it's nice of you to say, and it's funny to hear.
Well, I mean, it's like the whole business of influence is just aggravating, because what it suggests is that somebody who's already thinking about something wouldn't have done it if the other person hadn't provided the raw material, which is just nuts.
Right.
Influence is often basically permission or encouragement,
Exactly.
or even a challenge. I'll show that guy that I can do it even better.
Exactly.
You know, and that's a different deal.
No, it's more like a kind of dialogue, either frequently with fantasies of dead people.
Playing with dead things, all of my Kelly.
Yeah, I see dead people. You know, like, yeah. I mean, imagining a kind of conversation through objects with someone who's not present. Mm-hmm. And no, influence is an aggravating term, because to deny it just seems defensive. Mm-hmm. And, you know, we all live in the world, and we all have to start somewhere. So influence is a given, really. But there's unhealthy influence and healthy influence, and there's influence which is, as you say, more of a kind of debate or a confrontation in one's mind, and then there's influences that are just like, okay, I give up, I'll do what you said, or, you know, I mean, mm-hmm. There are all kinds of ways it can play out. But the fact is, most artists, I don't know any artists who don't think a lot about other art. You know, it's kind of, like I said before, it's part of the diet of being an artist.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, there was an interview with you done recently in The Believer, and you said that you were interested in Jung. Am I correct? Mm-hmm. And Jung's basic notion that there are, you know, archetypes that belong collectively to all of us.
Right.
And I would say not just archetypes in the sense of an image, but also intonations, registers, phrasings, ways of making things. So in some respects, you know, Picasso is channeling you. I mean, not in terms of a timeline, but in fact, you're playing with the same material. You have very different reasons for it, and some maybe overlapping reasons, and you have very different ways of doing it, and some perhaps overlapping reasons. But it's because those things actually exist out there someplace. They're part of human consciousness, and they're there to be mined.
I think so. And I become more and more convinced of it. And you can think of it as a kind of, new agey kind of thing, or you can think of it almost as genetics. It doesn't really matter to me how one thinks about it. You think about it as hard wiring of the brain, or you can think about it as something more spiritual, or maybe those two things are the same. But I do think that things are in the air, and time doesn't always run in one direction, in terms of connections to things, causality. But we're getting a little outside of our field of expertise here. So.
No, I don't think so. Not necessarily. Artists can talk about what artists want to talk about.
They can talk about whatever they want, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, and then we'll probably open it up to the audience. But there's, Harold Bloom, who teaches at Yale, has this theory that called the anxiety of influence, and basically he says, that the drama of artists coming into the world is an Oedipal drama, that you have your father figures that you have to deal with and reject or whatever it is. But the part of his idea, which I think is the most interesting, is not that you kill the father, but that you creatively misunderstand him. The creative misprision is the way in which you get it wrong in order to get it right.
Right.
And so maybe in relation to, for example, anger, and you can see it very clearly in the things that are in the Picasso section, that Picasso was getting anger wrong in order to get Picasso right. If you look at Dubuffet, clearly he was getting Picasso wrong in certain ways in order to get Dubuffet right. And Giacometti is a somewhat special case because he was the son and nephew of Impressionist painters.
Mm-hmm.
And so he misconstrued Impressionism in his own way, both by making sculptures instead of paintings mostly, and when he made paintings, he made grayscale, grisaille paintings, not luminous paintings. But, there are drawings of Giacometti very reverentially drawing Matisse when he was in bed making his cutouts, which are at the Modern now. So there are all of these ways in which, you can't deny that there are other people in the room, but they're not there to influence you. They're there for some other reason, and
Yeah.
some other effect.
All kinds of reasons.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that's, my thought about Picasso is this kind of philosopher character within painting. His relationship to earlier art is crazy. I mean, what he was willing to do, like, dealing with Poussin, dealing with Velázquez, dealing with Goya, dealing with all these different things as his own subject matter, and turning them into his work is both like, talk about misunderstanding the parent or whatever, it's like simultaneously really violent and really reverential, and all him.
Okay, maybe that's a good thing. Let's open it up to the floor. If people have questions or comments, are there mics out there? I think they might be. If not, could you just speak up sufficiently loudly that we can hear what you say? And I'll repeat the question if the back of the room can't hear it.
This lady here.
Yeah, go.
I should just speak loudly.
Just do it.
No, we can hear you.
Okay, maybe you can repeat.
I'll repeat it so that other people can hear you.
So one of you brought up the word, I think it might be you, Robert, brought up the word crude early on.
Mhm.
You were describing the work in the show, but also I think maybe in reference to your work, Carl. And I think that's it's sort of such a perfect word because it's so double-sided, sort of double-edged. On one end, it refers to perversity and sort of sexiness, and on the other hand, sort of
You mean, well, it sounds like your question is more about the word crude, yeah? Or, I mean, because you're right, it does, it's interesting, it does kind of have two different meanings.
It's about the word, yeah, but it's about the way that those two meanings, in some ways, inform and complicate each other. So when I think about your work being crude or Dubuffet being crude, I really think about it being sort of perverted in some ways, like erotic or sexy or sort of possessing of some sexual innuendo. And I also think about sort of the crudeness of the application of paint as being kind of blunter or less sophisticated, sort of, an deliberate sense.
Well, I think I prefer the idea of directness than I do to, I mean, crude is a word I might use to refer to the facture in a painting, but I don't know that it would be a word I would use in its other meaning, like in the sense of a crude joke or a crude remark. And I don't know, I don't think of my own representation of what I do to myself isn't along those lines. Whereas I think a lot about how I make things, and I look at other painting. I mean, all the material in the show Rob's curated here, I think about very much in terms of how it was done, and levels of refinement, levels of, if you will, crudeness. But I think there are words that are more specific to particular layers of meaning, like you can talk about scatological subject matter, or you can talk about imagery that depicts human sexuality or human anatomy, but I don't think about things in that way, like crude.
I would just throw out that I think descaling is a myth. I think it's a rhetoric. I think it's a way of talking about the desire to break habits and choose alternative methods. But actually it's like riding a bicycle. Once you learn how to draw in a sort of classical academic way, you don't forget it, right? You may have no use for it, but you don't forget it. So that you have to start someplace else, and as you develop the skills in some other zone, you become as proficient, as refined, as uncrude in that way. And Dubuffet is a fine example of it. He studied the Prince Horton collection. He collected work of artists who generally were unskilled, although they had enormous abilities of a kind that are the equivalent of skill. And he learned another rhetoric. That's all, And I think the myth that these are either or choices also is debunked by Picasso, because Picasso said, I get up this morning and I do this. I get up tomorrow morning, I do that. I get up the next morning, I do something else, and I don't have to explain why I'm in those three places on 3 different days, and sometimes in both of them on one day. These are choices, and if you have artists who have the courage of their choices and who have the abilities that allow them really to make those choices, who are we to say this is crude versus refined? There are different ways of doing things that are in the hands of a knowing practitioner. Yeah.
Good question. I guess I was wondering how, just because I've been trying to think about this and study art history and doing some lecturing, so I'm learning how to do that. I'm wondering how when someone comes to you, obviously you have so many years of experience, but when someone comes to you with something like this, where there's this great richness and there's all this work, how do you go about curating?
This was just so the other people can hear. This was a question about how one curates out of a resource like the one that the Wexners offered us, and how, generally speaking, one makes something out of the raw materials of a collection. In some ways, it was very easy. I won't say it was a no-brainer. That's actually a phrase I hate. But everything that takes anything, including tying your shoes, takes a brain. But it was in one ways easy because they had collected extraordinary things and had a lot of them in certain categories. But, it is a matter of how do you shape a body of work, which is a private collector's trove and pleasure, into an exhibition that will make sense to people who are not looking at the collection. I mean, this is not a display of the Wexner collection, because there's much more that they have that we didn't put in. It's a display of work from the Wexner collection that was designed to make certain kinds of bodies of work clearer and dialogic one with the other. For example, he owns a very beautiful early Matisse drawing. And in one way, an art historian might say, okay, fine, we're doing a Picasso exhibition. We might as well throw in the Matisse because we know there's a Picasso-Matisse dialogue and so on. And as I said, that would be like throwing one poor Matisse into a room full of voracious Picassos, right? that's not a kindness to Matisse. So, and these guys were rivals if ever there were any. And there were other things in their collection one might have considered. So, as I said, this is a relatively easy one. The not easy part of it, and this I worked with Sherry and people in the staff here, was to how to put it up there, how to make this building and this type of building work with art of an entirely different kind. Also, the frames in these paintings are of a completely different era. And how do you show paintings of another time in frames of yet an earlier time in many cases, because some of Picasso's are framed with like 17th century frames, 16th century frames even. How do you show that in a building of this kind? How do I?
Take the slides and look at them and then just let it gel for a while, and then somebody, like when you were asking Mr. Dunham, like what he liked and what he didn't like, you just let it all live in there for a while, and then certain ones start to sort of talk to you.
Well, first of all, I saw the real paintings. I don't make shows from slides. I never have, and nobody ever should. You cannot make an exhibition of unique works of art unless you know those works pretty well. And I visited the Wexner's house years and years and years ago when they actually had a somewhat different collection than they have now. So I was very aware of what those works were, and I refreshed my exposure to them by going back to the house. But then beyond that, I mean, I'm a visual person. I'm as much a visual person as anybody, and I hold these things in my head. It's not really the reproduction so much; it's what's in here, and I shuffle the deck in my brain, and then once I sort of have a sense, then I do go to little kind of type reproductions. I'm like playing solitaire. Deal yourself a hand, and in what sequence and in where. I mean, one of the things I think a great deal about is that at any given point in an exhibition, wherever you look, you should see something that will, in some ways, either rhyme or interestingly contrast with the thing that you would otherwise be seeing if you turned a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. And the storytelling model of exhibitions is you march through and you learn what happened by going example A to example B to example C. And I think actually exhibitions are made by being in real space and being able to have a free spectator orient themselves in regard to where they think something exciting is happening, and then turn and then see something else that is likely to have an effect on how they see the thing they just saw, and vice versa. That's the way you make a show. It's like triple-decker chess.
I'm sorry, really hard for me to hear you.
Shout.
Do you think art will ever overcome this blockage of being philosophical? Do you think we'll be able to draw just for the sake of drawing or paint for the sake of painting? Do you think that we'll ever have this opportunity to put imagination back into art?
Oh yeah, I think it's. I mean, I don't think it's. I don't think it's kind of an either-or thing where it's. I mean, her question is about what I said about acknowledging imagination as a source of visual art, which I guess I meant in the sense of as opposed to just shuffling cultural sources. And it's sort of a tricky thing to talk about because in a way, we always are embedded in our time, and we're making art about that. But I think I'm really more advocating a kind of looking inward for whatever you want to say, inspiration, than I am than thinking that by messing with things, recombining things in the world, that one is going to come up with something new. But I don't think that it's not so much a case that that there are no artists out in the world using their imagination. It's more that it's not really a way that people discuss art anymore. You know, it's discussed so much from either a theoretical or an historical point of view, and not from the point of view of direct kind of, you know, we have a wellspring of images in our head. Now, that's what a lot of what thinking is. It's just pictures all the time, over and over. And art comes from the same place, and I just think it would be interesting if it were talked about more.
And I think that's actually a very good place to end this. Again, we tried to make a conversation about painting from a painter, so thank you.